music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to our first ever live show of ChinaEconTalk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider, here today with Martin Rasser and 50 of the most intelligent and attractive people to ever attend a think tank event in Washington, D.C. Okay, Martin is a senior fellow at CNAS. Previously, he spent a long time at the CIA researching emerging tech, innovation, and weapons development. He also served as a senior advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Martin, welcome to ChinaEconTalk.
Great to be here, Jordan. Thank you.
So can you talk a little bit about the way the IC thinks through things versus what you've seen in the past working at think tanks over the past few months and years?
Sure, absolutely. So the work itself, like how you approach analysis of research, it's actually very similar. It's more so the sources of information. Obviously, as an intelligence analyst, you have access to a lot more. Another big difference is that at a think tank, most organizations, you don't take an institutional position. So in my job, I can write op-eds on topics that I feel are important. I don't have to check with anyone do you agree with my analysis? At CIA, it's an agency product. So there's a lengthy coordination process, and everyone has a chance to do comments, line edits, and so forth. And the final product is truly an agency product. And then you also have community-wide projects. That's primarily through the National Intelligence Council. So NIE's, National Intelligence Estimates, ICA's, Intelligence Community Assessments. Every now and then you'll see some of those mentioned in the news. The Iraq WMD is a famous one. That was an NIE. And the Russia election interference, that was an ICA. So every now and then you'll get a glimpse of some of the things that the IC does.
Sure. So after you traded in your badge and your ability to see all the secret stuff, you went to Muddy Waters, a famous investment firm which digs up dirt on sketchy listed Chinese companies. So what was that like, trying to, dig but then get to share the stuff with the world?
The Muddy Waters experience was fantastic. If you guys don't know about it, check out the website. All the reports that Carson Block, who founded Muddy Waters, did, they're all freely available, so you can download them and read them. They're a fascinating read. What Carson specialized in was uncovering fraud, a lot of times in Chinese firms that are listed on U.S. markets. One of the favorite projects that I worked on while I was there was a Chinese company called Huishan Dairy. So here what we did is we were made aware of this Chinese dairy firm that was claiming just incredible yields, the amount of milk that their cows produce, tremendous profits on their milk, their yogurt, their cheese.
They're super cows.
They were super cows.
What's the problem with them?
Yeah, so
it's like 1956, right?
So
once
once we started digging a little bit, we realized that in order for them to actually produce as much dairy as they claimed, they would have to have the most productive cows in the world. They would have to have their factories operate at full capacity, nonstop. So we started digging a little. We had a crew of people on the ground in China. And we, started counting trucks. How many go into the facility? How many come out? We had people visit the dairy farms. We had people visit the alfalfa fields where they grow the feed for the cows.
But did you personally milk any of the cows?
I would have loved to. I learned so much about dairy farming and how to take care of a cow. They have massagers for cows. Did you know that? I didn't. They have to be at a certain temperature. They like a certain humidity level. They love to eat alfalfa. And yeah, if you do that all well, you can have super cows. This Huishan Dairy did not have super cows. I'll just cut it short there. But yeah, the company ended up being a huge fraud. We published the report. Unlike with most reports that Muddy Waters publishes, the stock did not crater immediately. It actually took some time, but finally when the CFO just disappeared with a bunch of money, people realized, there's probably something screwy going on. And but for young China watchers in particular, Muddy Waters does a huge service for financial markets, both here in the United States, but also in Hong Kong. As you probably know, there's a ton of fraud going on in Chinese businesses, and Carson Block is one of the people that exposes this to the public. So he's doing a great service.
I want to tell the story that I read in Caixin recently of like the way that the African swine flu spread across China, because I just thought it was the funniest thing on the planet and like horrifying. So basically it was very localized at first, so they started like culling the pigs, but the way they did the payments for the farmers whose livelihoods were wrapped up in these like livestock was 20% Zhongyang-Zhongfu, so 20% central government and 80% provincial and local. And very quickly the farmers realized that no, in fact, that 80% was not going to show up. So what happened were these like pig gangs would show up to the farmers and say, hey, we'll give you 50 cents on the renminbi and take your pigs off your hand. And then they would proceed to re-tag the pigs. So, it goes from like a place that everyone knows it's sick to like, happy, like, Qinghai pigs or whatever. And, within 2 months you have swine flu in every province in China because it was like an underground trafficking of sick pigs to spread across the world. So not just dairy that has issues in China, as the world has learned over the past few months.
Yeah, China in a nutshell right there.
There you go. So tech Cold War. Is this a phrase that people should be using? And if not, why?
I don't like the phrase. It's a tech competition for sure, but tech Cold War has all these connotations that A, I don't think are right, and B, I don't see the benefit of calling it that. There's still plenty of room for engagement and cooperation with China. Calling it a Cold War doesn't make sense. Absolutely, we're in a competition, but a competition does not mean conflict. Competition means you take advantage of your strengths and you try to find the weak spots in the people you're competing with. So no, I think that's just not a good phrase to use at all, and I wish people would stop. So
what is your like optimistic and negative scenario of how the U.S.-China tech relationship could evolve over the next decade or so?
Well, I think the path that we're heading down is, we're going to continue to be intertwined with China where it makes sense. We're going to disengage in areas where the United States wants to preserve its strategic edge. So, for example, in advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, yeah, you'll probably see a push for export controls in that area. But in other areas, good room for engagement would be, for instance, in co-research on artificial intelligence safety, AI ethics, areas like that where there's mutual benefit, not just for bilateral relations, but just globally speaking.
What are the sorts of events that you think could alter this trajectory? What would be an equivalent of like a Snowden leaks to sort of change the game in the way these two countries relate to each other on a technology side? Or do you think we're pretty path dependent at this point?
We'll know a lot more in about 6 months, right? So the trade talks started up again today. It depends on, can both sides come up with solutions where they don't lose face. A lot of the rhetoric right now, I feel that both Xi and Trump have painted themselves into a corner to a certain extent. Are they willing to, I wouldn't say embarrass themselves, but are they willing to, take a little bit of flack from the hardcore hawks on both sides to come to some type of arrangement? Because I do think there's still middle ground to be found, but we can't go down this path much longer before more negative aspects of the relationship start really dominating the conversation overall.
Sure. So, Martin, what is a rare earth?
Rare earth.
And what's your favorite?
Okay, so this is a group of elements. So they're on the periodic table. Up until probably 6-7 months ago, vast majority of people had no clue what they were, but they end up being very vital elements for products that are very important to us, things we use every day. So your computers, cell phones, pacemakers, and they're also very important for military items like missile guidance systems. They're used a lot in the F-35, for example, that has several 100 pounds of rare earth elements. The Virginia-class submarine has nearly 1,000 pounds. So unlike the name suggests, however, they're actually not that rare. Most of them are quite prevalent.
Are any of them pretty?
Some are, yes. Dysprosium is very nice and silvery.
Okay.
So, yeah, they've got all kinds of interesting qualities and colors.
I kind of want like a charm bracelet of them, you know.
Yeah, you could. Some of them are radioactive, but,
well,
be my guest.
You know.
But the whole reason this is in the news now is because China, dominates the market. They control right now about 80% of the global supply, but more importantly, they dominate the production. So the processing is very difficult because these elements are intertwined with a bunch of other stuff, so you have to extract and separate. The reason that this happened is because both the mining and the processing, it's very polluting. And so a lot of countries, even though they have ample reserves, a lot of the outsourcing happened on the processing end. So China cornered that market and controlled it. Now, when the trade dispute started flaring up, one of the threats was that China threw out there was, well, we may just curtail our rare earth exports. Right now, that has tremendous impact on the United States because we only have one mine that recently reopened, and the United States has no processing
Where is it?
capabilities. It's at the Mountain Pass mine in California.
Okay.
But there's
Is
also
there like missile defense around it? Like just
no. It was shuttered up until I think 18 months ago.
Okay.
But there's
like weed growing all around, basically.
various kinds, yes, I'm sure, since it's California. But now there's movement afoot to open up new mines in Texas, for example. Some people think the Greenland Purchase idea was largely driven by rare earths. I don't know how true that is, but there are deposits up there. But more critically, we need new processing facilities. There is a company proposing to build one in Texas, together with an Australian company called Lynas. Lynas also has its own mines in Australia that it's starting up again and wants to build new processing capabilities. So, long story short, yes, China's threat is real, but it has a time limit on it. Basically, in about 2 years' time, the United States and Australia, Japan, and so forth can have a very secure and diverse supply chain. So if China does want to use the threat of curtailing exports, it's running, the window's closing on being able to do that. So we'll see what happens. I think the trade talks would have to get pretty nasty for China to play that card, but it's a card that they do have. And if they want to play it, again, 18, 24 months is about the time they have.
All right, so I'm sleeping reasonably well at night when it comes to this issue.
Good, you should.
5G, a little bit less so. So what is it and why does it matter?
5G is the next generation of wireless telecommunication. So all the phones you have in your pockets right now are 4G, fourth generation. 5G has the potential to be truly transformative. Much higher bandwidth, lower latency. You've probably heard people talking about the Internet of Things. 5G is what's really going to make that happen because you can have so many more devices connected with the bandwidth so much higher than it is. You can start doing things like autonomous vehicles, telemedicine. So that's doing a remote surgery, whole host of things. In the defense community, they're very excited about improved communications, situational awareness. It has tremendous potential to be truly transformative for our economy, how we communicate, how we live. Everything would be interconnected. People, machines.
So, Martin, what's your 4-minute case about why people should be worried about Huawei?
One at the top of my list is cybersecurity. Because all these devices that we'll have will be interconnected, you have many more vectors for attack. Now, Huawei, as a company called Finite State has shown, this is an American cybersecurity firm, the quality of Huawei software is very poor. Finite State did not divine intent as to why this is, but the fact is that Huawei software, they found backdoors in the firmware. There's a lot of outdated issues that haven't been patched. And Huawei also has a very poor track record of addressing and fixing those issues.
Well, here's my question, Martin. I mean, we just saw a week ago that there were all these day one iOS things. So isn't it just impossible to write good software, or are there levels of caring, which then end up leading into more or less vulnerable things that are easier or harder to hack.
Yeah, it's a level of caring. Every software has bugs. You're never going to have bug-free software. But the issue with Huawei is comparatively the quality of their software is much worse.
Sure.
And for example, they have this relationship with the British equivalent of the National Security Agency where the Brits are allowed to do some evaluations. If you read the annual reports that they produce, they're also complaining that Huawei isn't sufficiently addressing these concerns. So you've got that aspect of it. Another concern is just the broader relationship with the Chinese state. So both the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, with the National Intelligence Law as written. If asked, Huawei would have to provide access to their networks, their equipment, if the PLA would want that. Even if that law didn't exist, I don't think a Chinese company would have any recourse of saying no, because what court do you go to? Who do you complain to? So that's a big concern. And that's the reason why Huawei is not allowed on U.S. networks. That's the same reason why Australia has gone down that path, and other countries like the Czech Republic, Japan, they don't want Huawei on their networks. And then there's just the general issue of governance, right? Huawei is a very opaque organization. They're cagey about their ownership structure. They're dealing with North Korea, Syria, Sudan, trying to hide that fact. The whole reason Huawei's on the entity list is because they violated international sanctions on Iran and tried to cover it up and committed obstruction of justice in trying to cover their tracks. So in totality, all these things, in my opinion, don't strike me as it being a good idea of dealing with Huawei.
So, they recently put out this proposal saying they'd be open to just licensing all of their technology and letting someone build a competitor on their, entire hardware and software stack. Sounds good to me. Like, who wants to write me a $50 million or $500 million check to pull that one off? But what's the worry with this? Sounds great.
It's an interesting proposal. My first reaction when I heard that was it reminded me of that great line from Spinal Tap. It's a fine line between clever and stupid.
Okay.
And at first glance, this is really interesting. But then when you start thinking about it, what they're actually proposing is, so some Western company would pay a one-time licensing fee to Huawei for their patent portfolio, their know-how, and their source code. And then you could take all that and build your own products. Now, because you have access to the source code and most Western companies don't trust Huawei, you would have to redo the source code, then build all the binaries, all the firmware that you would need to put on your hardware. Oh, by the way, then you need to manufacture your own hardware on top of that. So essentially you're looking at building a company from scratch using some aspects of another company's technology. So why do that, right? You could just start on your own instead of paying somebody else for the privilege of using their stuff as
I think I have the heart of a wolf, but they didn't take me when I applied to work there. So I'm just gonna build a better version.
Yeah. And on top of that, so say someone actually did that, then okay, so you want to compete with Huawei on the global market? You still can't compete with them on price because with all the subsidies they receive, they'll undercut you wherever you go. So at best, you'll only be able to sell to a few Western markets. So the whole deal to me just doesn't make sense. I give them, credit for coming out with this because they hoodwinked Tom Friedman and The Economist in trying to announce this. So, kudos to them. It's an awesome PR stunt, but from a business standpoint, it doesn't make sense.
I gotta say, after misstep and just like embarrassing interview after embarrassing interview, them finally like finding like one halfway decent card to play in the public arena was pretty impressive.
Yeah, they did a nice job. It was commendable on that front.
So let's talk about the standard setting process. What is this and why does it matter?
So in telecommunications, or in many things, but since we're talking about telecom, so standard setting is necessary in order to have all our equipment be interoperable. And so how the whole process works is representatives from all the manufacturers of equipment get together and pretty much hash out whose technology they're going to use to be the standard for 5G. So you've got all these building blocks. The company that has the standard for a particular function then gains something called a SEP, and this SEP, SEP, then provides licensing income. So every other company that has to use that technology for a handset or some other type of hardware makes money for each one of these items that's sold. So it's very lucrative if you have a lot of these standards in your pocket, and that's how a lot of companies recoup their R&D expenditures.
Sure. It's sort of like weirdly inspiring, this just like happy story of like international competition and cooperation,
right.
and people sort of like working really hard but then like getting together and hashing things out.
And traditionally this system has worked very well. You have actually relatively junior people hashing all this out. And up until recently, this whole system has worked very well. What's happened for 5G is that Huawei has been very aggressive in pushing their technology as the standards. Mm-hmm. And anecdotally, what I've heard is that Chinese companies are voting as a bloc, so that all the companies will support Huawei's technology, even though Chinese companies in private will admit that that was not the best technology solution.
Interesting.
So far, American and European companies have not done that. They just vote for what they think is best because, as technologists, it's hard. They want to see the best technology win out. So there's a lot of concern with Huawei's tactics at these standard setting meetings and pushing forward.
Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, like, sure. But I feel like it's something that's a little bit lost in the sort of DC narrative around Huawei. Just the fact that they're even in these discussions to begin with. 30 years ago, these guys were importing like Japanese radios, and so many other Chinese companies have like either not even tried or tried and failed to get at the global cutting edge when you're talking about really difficult sort of research and technology questions. So, on the one hand, yes, there are certainly many security concerns, but it's really interesting to see a firm that has just decided to have export discipline and actually care about selling stuff to the world as opposed to getting fat and happy on domestic contracts and selling to SOEs and whatnot, like almost every other firm in this in and around this high intensive like research space has done in China.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Huawei, they've done impressive things, right? They went from relabeling Cisco routers back in the 90s to now, they're innovating. They're doing a lot of R&D, and they're coming out with reasonably good equipment. And yes, they've come a long way, but I do feel that they've come this far in large part due to theft, cheating, and unfair subsidies.
All I'm saying is like everyone's cheating and everyone's stealing stuff in China, but like Ren Zhengfei is just better at it.
Sure.
So
sure.
Hats off to him.
All right.
But yeah, so people are sort of I've read a few articles talking about how this is like a big strategic mistake for the U.S. that there's no big telecom firm that is sort of at the level of a Ericsson or a Qualcomm. Like, do you think this was a mistake the U.S. did in not supporting it as like 2008 Ford bailout, or like you think this is like something that should be in the sort of military industrial complex where it kind of gets propped up by, or it should have been propped up by the government, or is it okay that the leading lights in this are now in China and Europe?
No, I don't think nationalization is the answer. We're all about free markets. I think both the government made some poor decisions in terms of regulation back in the 90s. But the private sector did as well. And so, there's no use in crying over spilt milk. We are where we are. Mm-hmm. So what I would propose is that we regain the initiative and really shake up the structure of the telecommunications market as to Right now, it's very much hardware focused, which Huawei has been very good at. But there's several groups that are very interested in virtualizing networks, meaning switching to a software-focused model. And this is an area where U.S. companies in particular would be very strong because the United States is very good at software. And you start addressing a lot of concerns that people have now with very few vendors being able to produce 5G equipment. So on virtualized networks, all the hardware would be generic, white box software. It's the software that is the differentiator. And so what you would have then is that you can compete on software. And because software is so versatile, you can start, it's almost like a buffet. You can take little bits and pieces and produce much more customizable products. Because the barriers of entry to software are so much lower, you will encourage more people to re-enter the market. So you get that competition back, you get that supplier diversity. Customers then have much greater choice, and choice brings leverage. So this should bring prices down. And because these companies are competing on software products that all have to be interoperable, there's already that incentive to have much higher security standards. And then the differentiator, why you're better than your competitor, is even better security features. So I think we should think much harder about
Just wait until 6G.
Well, it's never too soon, right? I mean, countries and companies are already researching 6G technologies, including Huawei. Again, this is early research that's happening, but they're already planning what's coming 10 years from now. The United States would be wise to invest more in this type of R&D now so that we don't don't find ourselves in the same position 10 years from now where we're concerned about the lack of choice with vendors, all these security issues. So if we grab the bull by the horns, we can try and avoid those steps much more effectively, I think.
So, we were talking earlier about rare earths, and you were saying, there's like a 24-month window where like the China could pull one over on the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Why not sort of take the same approach to 5G and be like, hey, let's save some money and buy some Huawei boxes, but 10 years from now, like we'll have figured this out. Is this too important to sort of go down that path?
Well, I mean, if say we we went all in on network virtualization. I don't think 24 months is realistic, but perhaps 5 to 7 years. Yes, we could upend the market and have a whole new approach. But that'll take a concerted effort amongst U.S. companies, but also on a multinational basis, right? We would have to cooperate and collaborate with the Europeans, with the Japanese, the South Koreans.
In the meantime, I'll just hang out in China with my 5G until the U.S. gets its happy networks, right?
Yes, yeah, you can check Twitter and Gmail and all that, right?
So deep fakes. What's your thinking on this, and why is this such a scary issue?
Well,
what's scary about deep fakes?
Well, the technology to make deep fakes, it's getting better and better by the day. Like audio is, pretty much indistinguishable.
Did you hear that Joe Rogan thing? That was horrifying.
I heard about it. I haven't heard the recording itself yet.
It was good enough to beat me. I was very impressed.
Yeah. Then people have already committed crimes, right? They had a recording of what sounded like the CEO of a company, and people just walked away with a ton of cash doing this. So it's already happening in audio. Video is very, very close to being the same way. And, it's easier and easier to obtain this stuff. So, yes. So from a technology standpoint, we're pretty much there. Then there's the fact it's so easy to proliferate fake media. All the social media we have, just one little click, you retweet, you forward, you like. It can spread like wildfire very quickly. And then I think a third aspect is, just as human beings, we have these cognitive deficiencies, these weaknesses that just make us very prone to believing things just because we want to see what we want to see. So even if we paused and thought for a moment, could this really be? But, we have this habit of just clicking, retweeting. So one thing we need to do is just become smarter about how we use our social media, because there's been some proposals, like for instance, having like a 20-second pause before you're able to retweet something. I think that
Terrible idea.
You think so?
It would ruin it. It's no fun otherwise. I don't know. Okay. The Democratic primary. So what has struck you about the sort of conversations going on the debate stage around technology in China?
Well, I think all the main candidates have pretty much articulated that they see the U.S. as being in a competition with China. So on that front, there's really very little daylight between the candidates and President Trump. You see the same thing on Capitol Hill. It's very much a near consensus on a bipartisan basis that U.S.-China relations were in a competition. There's some differences in what to do about it, right? I think Warren and Sanders have emphasized just the struggle against authoritarianism more. Mayor Pete, he's been emphasizing national renewal, right? He sees this as an opportunity for America to rejuvenate itself, like double down on R&D spending, and really think big thoughts again and achieve big things. Which
I guess we know who you're voting for.
Oh, I mean,
just kidding. Sorry,
it's a little early for that.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Let's do a Q&A. You guys have questions?
So should export controls apply to standardization? The reason I ask is because the most recent temporary general license for Huawei made a series of assertions about the scope of activities that could be engaged with Huawei with respect to standardization, both in the license itself, and then BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security, issued 2 follow-up FAQs. So do you see the ability of companies to engage in standardization as being a part of export controls or being covered by export controls?
I think that's going to be just a temporary measure, because ultimately it's not sustainable, right? If you have a company that's accounting for 40% of the telecommunications market worldwide, you're going to have to engage with them, particularly on discussing security matters. So I think that's just a temporary thing that will be reversed. I don't know the reasoning behind doing that, so I can't comment as to the motivation specifically. But no, I don't see that being a long-term issue.
Yes, thank you. My question actually has more to do with 2 things. First, you said 5G is great for the future, for the Internet of Things, for productivity. One of the things is I think the thing that's probably more applicable or immediately applicable to a lot of consumers, instead of if my phone could use 5G technology next year or further down the road, it's more, what are the home appliance products doing at my home, right? And in China, there's not just Huawei. There's also other companies, telecommunication companies, producing home appliance products like Xiaomi. And these are coming to Western markets, including the United States, at a much faster rate, at a much greater amount. And what should the United States government do about that? Because when these devices are connected to the internet by the millions and millions, are they serious security risks for the United States? And how do you address that? And second question is, now the United States pretty much has convinced itself that it needs to seriously step up its game and create alternatives like what you described to what Huawei has to offer, for instance. But what is stopping all the other countries, including some key U.S. allies, to not adopt and not use Huawei technologies? Because if you look across the board, even in Europe, Germany is not committed. It is inclined to actually work with Huawei, and there's a number of people in the UK government who are also inclined to believe that through government regulatory intervention, they could have a optimal situation where they put the risk of working with Huawei equipment and software to the minimum. And how should the United States government and the private sector react to that?
Oh, those,
I just want to say, first off, I've had so much fun on those Lime bikes that I am more than happy to trade off all my privacy and security to keep like zooming around. But
those were fantastic questions. Hopefully I can remember them all. Let me so first on what other countries are doing with Huawei. So you mentioned Germany. Really what it comes down to is what's your tolerance for risk. Some countries believe that even though let me take a step back. I think as far as U.S. allies and partners go, I think there's little daylight between them as to the perception of risk from Huawei. I think there's pretty broad agreement on that front. The difference is how different countries want to deal with that risk, how to mitigate it. So what the United Kingdom had been doing in the past on like its 4G network was only allowing Huawei on the edge of the network, so not putting it on the core, which is the critical network. The argument that the Australians have proposed is that with 5G, with the nature of the network, just the complexity, how intertwined it is, that distinction between core and edge doesn't exist anymore. And so that you really are not able to mitigate in that way. The U.S. agrees with Australia, as do some other countries. Germany, the Netherlands, I believe, are considering allowing Huawei on their networks. The U.K. is still deciding. Yeah, if countries think that they can adequately mitigate the risk by doing that, I wish them well. I personally am not optimistic. And that then obviously poses a challenge to us, right? Because ultimately we're all interconnected, so there is increased risk, particularly if in the horrible event that we find ourselves at war in Europe, for example, U.S. military forces will be using networks with Huawei equipment on it.
Sure.
Department of Defense is working on ways to be able to communicate securely by bypassing that. And, over time, I think, yes, that will be doable.
So question number one was,
in the house, right?
Yeah, Xiaomi, no one's worried about, should they be?
Basically, every time you bring an internet-connected device into your home, yes, you add to your risk profile, right? And it doesn't matter where that device is made. Everything can be hacked. Nothing is foolproof. I would venture to say that a lot of Chinese-made equipment, because of poor software engineering practices, are more easily hacked. But yeah, you have to take measures to protect yourself. And you'll see a whole new industry springing up, with special firewalls and virus scanning and so forth for your thermostat, your refrigerator, your doorbell, whatever the case may be. But that's just going to be the reality of it. But yeah, the only secure thing would be not to have those devices in your house. But for most people, I think convenience will trump security concerns.
I feel like a really obnoxious hack, if China just wanted to piss people off, would be just turning every Nest in America 3 degrees down. Everyone's like, why are we cold? What's going on? I don't know.
Yeah. Kick off all these domestic disputes.
Seriously, right? Or I guess you sleep a little better, so maybe it actually would be a positive thing. Anyways, let's get a few more.
Hi. So I work for a ride-sharing company. And I just had a question. I do Chinese underground fraud, and I can see an increase in hacking of accounts, account takeovers, financial fraud. The problem working with a multinational company and protecting multinational companies is the lack of technology ethics that China has. How can we protect our companies, especially in America, from maybe actors that don't have those ethics and trying to decrease the amount of fraud? Because that does take a significant financial loss in the American economy and in successful businesses that affects us here as well as internationally.
Well, it's always important for the United States to promote norms and values, ethics for technology. This would be a good example of why that's needed.
Pretty sure Travis Kalanick would still be a CEO in China in 2019.
And that's part of the trade dispute with China right now is Washington's frustration that Beijing isn't cracking down on this type of crime more. I think the sense in the administration and in Congress is that Beijing has the power to do more, but is choosing not to do so. That's probably being debated, as we sit here right now.
Just a follow-up question with 5G, 6G, this is only going to increase fraud. And so will the Chinese government have to do something about this? Or are they able to just continue with fraud and technology and able to, control the population and whatnot without having to do anything? That's I'm also thinking of the future as well, I guess.
Yeah, with so many more internet connected devices, yes, you have many more vectors of attack, many more creative ways to try and steal from people. But at a certain point, particularly if it starts affecting domestic stability, yeah, I would expect the Chinese authorities to crack down more. But if they direct their energies outside the borders, maybe not as much. But, the United States, the international community has leverage. And if the problem gets too big, yeah, I would expect the screws to be tightened.
I have a short question for you. So we've spoken a lot about, or you've spoken a lot, about the security concerns of Huawei in particular to mostly Western developed countries. But I think it's difficult to understate the extent to which Chinese firms have already penetrated the markets of developing countries, especially South Asia, Africa. I'm wondering what long-term implications you see possibly in either security concerns or perhaps the orientation of these countries in orientation towards Chinese rather than, say, American technology, especially considering the building blocks type stuff you were talking about.
Yep. No, that's a great point. I think, there were these great examples, right, in, where was it, Uganda, where Huawei employees were accused of helping to spy on political opposition. Then if you look at it in the broader context of Belt and Road, yeah, China is trying to exert greater influence, kind of like a soft power in Africa, South America especially as well. And doing that in part through, attractively priced infrastructure projects. Another concern is how these technologies are being used by some countries. Authoritarian regimes like in Egypt, Venezuela, they're using Chinese surveillance technology to suppress their populations. And then you need to start thinking, well, what should the international community do about Chinese exports of technologies that are being used in illiberal ways? That's a debate we should have as a country. That's a debate we should have as an international community, because don't forget, a lot of these Chinese surveillance cameras with facial recognition, there are Western components in those devices. So should we get to a point where we place export controls on components like that to help stem the tide of those types of capabilities? So, yeah, that was a great question. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you again about Huawei, and my understanding is that the United States issued two decisions regarding Huawei. One which basically prevents Huawei products from being used in U.S. networks, and the other which prevents U.S. companies from engaging in business with Huawei. That's what got the reprieve. Can you describe and differentiate the rationale between using those two different trade tools? Are either of these a national security risk, or is it a national economic security risk? What's the objective from using U.S. companies and preventing U.S. companies from engaging with the Chinese company? And is it different from the rationale of preventing a Chinese company from selling to the U.S. market?
Excellent question. So this is one of these issues that is not well understood, but the press is partly at fault for how they report it. But then also, there's some messaging issues where the distinction gets lost. So there was an executive order in March. That's the reason why Huawei equipment is not on U.S. networks. Now, if you go back and look at the executive order, however, Huawei is not mentioned in that document. In fact, neither is China. So this wasn't targeted specifically at Huawei, wasn't targeted specifically at China. Now, reading between the lines, yes, the administration was looking at China primarily, but you could easily apply that executive order to others. The whole issue of U.S. companies being restricted in what they sell to Huawei, that's a separate issue. So this was the entity listing. Huawei was placed on the entity list because Huawei violated international sanctions on Iran and obstructed justice as a part of that, and also is being accused of intellectual property theft. So the entity list and the executive order are separate issues. What will happen with the entity list? Right now, U.S. companies are still allowed to sell certain items to Huawei, so they haven't been cut off completely. Micron, for instance, their second quarter earnings were actually quite good, based in large part due to their continued sales to Huawei. I think what you'll start seeing as primarily the semiconductor industry and the administration are in discussions, that you'll see, not the cutting edge equipment, what I call commodity chips, for lack of a better term. You'll probably see more sales of those over time. There's no reason, why do we care if Huawei is selling handsets with US chips in China? Why not, right? Because in part, you don't want to push China into a corner where they're forced to completely indigenize semiconductor manufacturing. It's good to have them rely on US suppliers for that technology. But you should not provide Huawei with the cutting edge equipment. So these are the advanced designs and the equipment to make the advanced designed semiconductors. That's a competitive edge, and that's what we should keep. But it's important to remember the entity list is for sanctions violations with Iran, and we've found out subsequently Huawei's been dealing with North Korea, Syria, Sudan, and probably some other companies as well. And
no Cuba? Come on.
Well, it hasn't been linked yet, at least in the press, but
it's not a bad list, let's
it's a nice rogues gallery, right? So
Hi. So it's my understanding, or my knowledge, that Silicon Valley doesn't really like to work with the U.S. government, especially the DoD. And it is my belief that in China, the government has a much closer relationship with these firms that are on the cutting edge. Do you think the U.S. government should be trying to do more to befriend Silicon Valley to maintain equal footing with the Chinese government on cutting edge technologies?
Yeah, I think engagement with Silicon Valley in particular would be, yes, it's necessary, and it would be good for the country. But, there's no more American thing than a U.S. company being able to tell the government, no, we won't work with you. That's their right. And that's what makes this a fantastic country, because U.S. companies have the freedom and ability to do that. The whole relationship, this gulf between D.C. and Silicon Valley, for one, I think it's a little overblown. There's plenty of very good tech companies working with the U.S. government, even with the U.S. Department of Defense. But yes, there is a bit of a culture divide, but there's good efforts underway to help bridge that. You've got the Defense Innovation Unit based out in Silicon Valley. They also have an outpost in Austin, Texas, and a few other cities. Those are good initiatives. You have a lot of, Washington, D.C. bureaucrats going to Silicon Valley and vice versa. So there's a dialogue. It'll just take some time, I think. There's a lot of misunderstanding in Silicon Valley as to what the U.S. military does. A lot of the uses for AI, for example, it's logistics, healthcare, education, preventive maintenance, not things that I think anyone would have any moral objections to. So that's one issue. And then at the same time, government folks here in D.C. need to learn to understand the culture in Silicon Valley a little better too. It's a two-way street, but just by talking and exchanging ideas, there's no reason why we can't close that gap more than it is now.
All right, Martin and Young China Washers DC, thanks so much for being a part of China Econ Talk.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from SUP China. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, and of course, the Sinica Podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.
So my in-laws just called to let us know they're on their way over and we're out of food. Great. Luckily, Instacart helps me get groceries delivered in as fast as an hour. Plenty of time to cook an in-law worthy meal. Now, what to make? Chicken parm. Perfect. Download the Instacart app or visit instacart.com to get $10 off your first order using the code PREPARED10. Now the only thing to worry about is dinner conversation. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum order $35. Delivery subject to availability. Additional terms apply.